today I'm going to talk about how to make subset tables using MySQL. So before we can talk about that, we first have to know what MySQL is. MySQL is a computer program. It allows you to manipulate different tables. You can combine tables, you can pull out information from a table and make a completely different table. So it's really important for computer scientists. MySQL also allows you to create databases and access them. So in a database, you have a whole bunch of different tables. So maybe you have a table that's just about students on the university campus, and you have another table that's just about housing situations. So you can access all that information through the database. It also may have information on professors and salaries and all that fun stuff. There's a lot there. It's kind of similar to R in a way. There's a computer programming language that you have to kind of learn, so that way you can tell MySQL what you want to do. So it's kind of similar to R. But before we can talk about how to code in SQL, we have to kind of understand how SQL processes what you tell it to do. And we can do that by looking at two equations. So before we look at equations, to understand how MySQL processes things, we're first going to learn what these two symbols mean. So the one that looks like a pie means that in a table, we're only interested in pulling out specific columns in that table. And the one that looks like a sigma notation means that we're only interested in pulling out specific rows or observations in the table. So now that we kind of know what those symbols mean, we can look at an example. So in MySQL, I created this table. So you have 4 variables or 4 attributes that are ID, name, major, and gender. And we have 7 observations in this table also. So now we're going to look at an equation to kind of understand how MySQL works. So just like orders of operations, we're going to start with the innermost parentheses, thing in the innermost parenthesis. So as you can see, we have the word student in there. And the reason why we have that is because I decided to call the table I created student. So now MySQL knows that we're only going to be looking at that specific table. Then if we go outside the parenthesis, we see we have our sigma notation, which means we're only going to be pulling out specific rows. And in subletters, there it says gender equals F. So for our table, we're only going to be looking at the gender attribute that has the capital letter F for the object. And also, as you can see, I have the letter F in single quotations, and that means that we're going to be looking at a string. So it's not going to be looking for lowercase f or j or g or anything like that. It's only going to be pulling out rows that have the uppercase F under gender. So when we run this in SQL, it's going to pull out this subset table as our final table. Now we kind of understand how MySQL processes what we ask it to do. We now have to translate this into a language that MySQL understands. So for this equation, we would enter it like this. So as you can see in the second row, it says from student, which means that we're only going to be looking at the student table that I created. And right above it, we see the word select and star. So next to select, it tells us what attributes or what variables or columns that we're going to be looking at and pulling out from the table. And since I have a star there, that means that we're going to be selecting all columns in the table. And the last line, where gender equals F, it looks at the rows in the table, and we're telling MySQL to only pull out the rows where gender equals F.
So is the program storing the data itself, or is the data stored in like an Excel file, and then this is a program you run on the side, or what is the interaction between like where you would type this and then like how you would actually look at that table of data?
Okay, it'd be easier if I had MySQL open, but we have our database, which has all the information stored in there, so it could have like 50 different tables. So we would go into that database and we say, okay, I want to pull out just the student table, and then maybe just courses that the students are taking. And then we can kind of play around with that on the side. And we can also save it in MySQL, and it'll get stored on your computer in your documents.
Okay.
Alright, so now we're going to look at another example. So once again, you start off with the innermost parentheses, so we're going to be only looking at the student table. And you see after that we have the pie notation, which means we're only going to be pulling out columns in the table. So we have name and major as subscripts. So we're only going to be pulling out the columns with the names name and major. And when we do that, this ends up being our final table. And to put this in a language that MySQL understands, you would have to enter the code like this. So once again, we're only going to be using the student table, which is why it says from student. And we're only going to be selecting columns with the name and major. So instead of having the star saying that we're selecting all columns, we have to indicate which attributes we want to pull out from the table. Alright, so now we're going to look at a little more complicated one, but it's not too complicated because we already talked about most of it. So always start with the innermost parentheses. So we're going to look at the student table. Then we're going to go outward, and we have our sigma notation, which is next. And we can see that we're only interested in pulling out rows that have major equals to math and statistics. So after MySQL pulls that out, we're at this table. Now we're going to go out a little further, and we can see that we have our pie notation, and we're only going to be pulling out attributes with the name and major. So our final table is going to look like this. So order of operations is pretty important for setting up your equation for MySQL, but you can also kind of rearrange the order of operations when it comes to like pulling out rows and columns. So I could have looked at columns first and then looked at rows, and I still would have ended up with the same table. But how you choose to set up your equation kind of depends on how the table is laid out. So I can show you what I mean with this. So as you can see from the top one, we have many more attributes than we do observations. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to narrow down our attributes as much as possible before we look at our observations. So we will want to pull out the columns first and then pull out the rows. And by doing this, it'll actually make MySQL run the program much more quickly. Alright, and for this one, we can see that it's kind of the reverse. So we have much more observations than we do attributes. So we're going to want to eliminate as many observations as possible before our attributes, so the program can run much more quickly, efficiently. So some of you may have noticed that the layout of MySQL is kind of similar to Excel, but I think that MySQL is actually much more efficient than Excel. So let's say you were interested in combining two tables. In MySQL, all you gotta do is enter into the code these two words called natural join, and the program will automatically join the two tables. And if you have, for example, you're interested in the classes that one particular student is taking, and you have the names in one table and the classes in another, it will duplicate the rows in your final table, so that way you have the name, the class, the name, the other class, all the way through your final table. So it's much more time efficient, because if you had to do that in Excel, it would take a very long time. And also in Excel, there's much more chance for error if you're trying to combine two tables, because you're probably going to end up copying and pasting. So there's much more chances of making a mistake than in MySQL. But overall, I think that MySQL is the better program to use.